Tess found the listing on a Thursday and signed the lease by Friday, which was exactly the kind of decision she had been making lately. Fast, instinctive, and without nearly enough information. The rent was low enough to feel like a mistake. The photos showed wide with floors and a deep porch, and the address put her 3 hours from the city she had spent the last 4 years trying to convince herself she loved. Harlow's Creek wasn't a place she had heard of before the listing appeared, and when she searched it online, she found almost nothing. A county map, a single review for a diner called Bette's, and a local government page that hadn't been updated since 2019. That should have told her something. She drove up on a Sunday with everything she owned packed into the back of a truck she'd borrowed from a friend, and the town came into view slowly, the way small towns do. First a water tower, then a cluster of rooftops, then a main street that was 4 blocks long and looked like it hadn't changed much since the 80s. It wasn't charming exactly, but it was solid, the kind of place that looked like it had made up its mind about what was a long time ago and stopped arguing with itself. She liked that. She pulled up to the house and sat in the truck for a moment looking at it. It was older than the photo suggested, the porch deeper, the tree line behind it closer. The woods pressed right up against the back edge of the property, with the kind of density that made the tree line look like a wall. She noticed that, and then stopped noticing it the way you do when you decide something isn't worth worrying about. She had the key from the landlord, a man named Hobbs, who had handed it to her through a truck window at the edge of town. Without getting out, told her the heat ran a little slow and to give an hour before deciding it was broken, and then driven off before she could ask anything else. The house smelled like cedar and something faintly metallic she couldn't place. The floors were good. The light came in clean through the front windows. She put her first box down in the kitchen and decided she had made the right call. The town itself took about 20 minutes to walk end to end, which she did that first afternoon, hands in her pockets, getting a feel for the layout. There was a diner, a hardware store, a small library that looked closed even though the sign said open, a church at the far end of the main street that she noticed had no denomination listed anywhere on the building, and a gas station run by a quiet man named Clyde who gave her a paper map of the area when she stopped in, the old kind, folded into a small rectangle, like he kept a stack of them specifically for new arrivals. She stopped into Bette's for coffee and ended up staying almost an hour. Bette herself was somewhere in her 60s, sharp-eyed and warm in the efficient way of someone who had been feeding people for decades and genuinely didn't mind it. She knew Tess had moved into the house by the tree line before Tess said a word about it. And when Tess asked how she knew, Bette just smiled and refilled her cup and said Harlow's Creek was small enough that a new truck parked in the driveway was basically a headline. Tess asked her what there was to do around here, and Bette listed a few things. The lake 2 miles out, a farmer's market on Saturdays through September, a small community hall that did movies on Friday nights. Through September, Tess noticed. She almost asked about October, but Bette had already moved to the next table, and the moment passed. The library was open, as it turned out, just dim. The woman behind the desk was young, maybe mid-20s, with close-cropped hair and the focused expression of someone doing 3 things at once. Her name tag said Rue. She looked up when Tess came in, and there was a half second where her expression did something complicated before settling back into neutral. She pointed Tess toward the local history section when asked and went back to whatever she was doing. Tess browsed for a while and found a thin-bound volume about Harlow's Creek that had been self-published sometime in the 90s, the kind of local history book that existed in a print run of maybe 200 copies and ended up in places like this. She sat down and read the first 50 pages, which covered the town's founding, its early industries, a long chapter about a mill that had burned down in 1934. Nothing unusual. She put it back and left, and it wasn't until she was halfway down the block that she realized Rue had been watching her from a window. Tess met Callen on her 3rd day. He lived 2 houses down, close to the main road, and she had seen him in passing, tall, somewhere in his late 30s, the kind of quiet that didn't feel unfriendly so much as deliberate. He stopped when he saw her struggling with a stuck window on the side of the house, and without much preamble came over and fixed it in about 4 minutes with a flathead screwdriver he happened to have in his jacket pocket. She thanked him, and he nodded, and she asked how long he'd lived in Harlow's Creek. And he said his whole life, said the way people do when the answer is so obvious to them it almost doesn't feel like information. She asked if he liked it, and he thought about that for a second longer than she expected before saying it was home and leaving it there. She didn't push. What she did notice was that when she mentioned the house, sat pretty close to the tree line, something moved across his face that was brief and controlled and gone before she could read it properly. He said the yard was a good size and changed the subject of the window, told her the frame had probably swollen with moisture and that she should check the others before winter. She thanked him again, and he went back down the block with his hands in his pockets, and she stood in the yard watching him go and wondering what it was she had just almost seen on his face. By the end of that first week, she had settled into a loose routine. Coffee at Bette's in the morning, unpacking in the afternoon, evenings on the porch watching the light go out of the sky over the tree line. The woods were quiet in a way she appreciated. No highway noise, no sirens, nothing. Just the occasional sound of wind moving through branches, and once, on the fourth night, something she couldn't identify, low and rhythmic, coming from somewhere deep in the trees, lasting about 30 seconds and then stopping clean. She sat with it for a moment and then went inside and told herself it was an animal. It was on the 6th day that she started noticing the shift in the town. Conversations at the diner had a different texture, shorter, more careful, like people were keeping something back without trying to be obvious about it. Clyde stopped making small talk at the gas station and just ran her card and handed it back. Even Bette seemed to be measuring her words in a way she hadn't been that first afternoon. Tess assumed she had done something wrong in the way newcomers sometimes do in small towns without knowing it, and she let it go. Then on the 7th day, she came out of a hardware store and noticed 3 of her neighbors on the same block doing the same thing at the same time, without speaking to each other, measuring their windows with actual tape measures, writing numbers down on notepads. She stood on the sidewalk and watched for a moment, and then walked home without saying anything because there was no one to say it to. That evening, Delia appeared at her door. Tess had seen her around town, an older woman, 70s maybe, with the kind of posture that suggested she had never once slouched in her life and didn't intend to start. She introduced herself without small talk, handed Tess a paper bag that contained a jar of something preserved and a bundle of dried herbs tied with kitchen twine, and said plainly that October was coming in heavy this year, and that Tess should make sure her doors had good seals and that her windows could latch from inside. Tess looked at the bag and then at Delia and asked what that meant. Delia told her she would understand soon, and that when she did, she should not make the mistake of thinking she was an exception to anything. Then she walked back across the yard with the unhurried certainty of someone who had delivered the message she came to deliver and considered it done. That night, Tess checked every window latch in the house without fully deciding to. She told herself it was just good sense going into winter. She told herself that twice. The fog came just after 9, not the kind that sits in low places and burns off by morning. This came in off the woods like something deliberate, thick and slow and moving against no wind, because there was no wind, pressing across the backyard and up against the glass with consistency that had nothing to do with weather. Tess stood at the kitchen window with her coffee going cold in her hand and watched it come and felt. For the first time since she had pulled into this town with her borrowed truck and her 2 boxes and her bad decision energy, that she was standing at the edge of something she had not been told about and could not yet name. She left the kitchen light on all night. By morning, the fog had pulled back to the tree line, and every window on her block had boards across it except hers. And when she stepped out onto the porch to look, none of her neighbors were outside, and the street was so quiet it felt less like early morning and more like something holding its breath. She went back inside and locked the door behind her and stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the bag Delia had left on the counter, the jar, and the dried herbs she hadn't touched. She picked up the jar and turned it over in her hands. There was no label. The contents were dark, almost black, and when she held up the kitchen light, she still couldn't tell what it was. She set it back down. She picked up her phone and searched Harlow's Creek Hollow season and got nothing. Searched Harlow's Creek October fog and got nothing useful. A weather forum post from 7 years ago that cut off mid-sentence. A cache page that returned an error. She put the phone down and looked out the window at the street. Still empty, still silent. The boarded windows on every house, but hers staring back like closed eyes, and understood for the first time that whatever this town was preparing for, she was already inside it. She thought about calling someone but couldn't land on who. Nobody from the city would take this seriously, and nobody here she trusted enough yet to ask directly. She was on her own with it for now, same as she had been on her own with most things lately, and she had learned by now that the only way through that feeling was straight ahead. She pulled on her jacket and walked to Bette's for coffee, and when she pushed through the door, every head in the place turned toward her at once, and the room went a half-second quieter than it should have. And then Bette was already reaching for a mug, and the moment passed. But Tess had caught it. She sat at the counter and wrapped both hands around the coffee, and decided that today she was going to get some answers. Callen was the one who told her, which surprised her because he had struck her as someone who would make her work for every word. She found him at the hardware store that morning, not shopping, just standing near the back talking to the owner in a low voice that stopped when she walked in. She bought a box of matches she didn't need, and on her way out said his name and told him she wanted to know what was happening. He looked at her for a long moment, then looked at the owner, then back at her, and said he'd meet her at Bette's in 10 minutes. He was there in 8. He sat across from her in the corner booth and kept his voice level and told her about the Hollow season, the way someone tells you something they've explained before and never once enjoyed explaining. It came every October, had for as long as anyone in Harlow's Creek could remember, longer than the oldest residents could account for, and longer than anything in the written record of the town. 11 days, always the same 11, starting on the 14th and lifting on the 24th, never varying by so much as a single day in either direction. The fog came in from the woods at night and retreated to the tree line by morning, and during those 11 days the rule was simple, and it was the only rule that mattered. No one went outside after dark. Tess asked him why. He said because the things that move in the fog were not from Harlow's Creek, and were not interested in being seen, and were not safe to be near. She asked him what kind of things. He said he didn't know exactly, and that was the honest answer. That nobody did. That what people knew was based on what had happened over the years to the people who hadn't followed the rule and the condition those people were in afterward. She asked him how many people that was, and he said enough. She asked him what condition. He picked up his coffee, set it back down, and told her about Lorna. Lorna Greer had lived in Harlow's Creek her whole life, had been through a dozen Hollow seasons without incident, knew the rule as well as anyone. 12 years ago on the 5th night, she went outside. Nobody knew why, nobody ever found out, and Callen's understanding was that Lorna herself couldn't explain it afterward. Not because she was hiding something, but because whatever had drawn her out had done it in a way that bypassed the part of the brain that records reasons. She was outside for less than 2 hours. She came back, walked through her own front door, went to bed, and by all appearances was completely fine. For 2 days, nobody thought anything was wrong. It was Delia who first said something, quietly, to her husband Otto, who told Harlan, who went to see Lorna himself. Tess asked what Harlan found. Callen said that Lorna looked like Lorna, sounded mostly like Lorna, knew everything Lorna would know, but there was something behind it that wasn't right. Something using the right words without understanding why they were the right words. Navigating conversations the way you navigate a room in the dark. Slowly, carefully, hands out in front. He said Delia described it as someone wearing a person like a coat that didn't quite fit. Tess sat with that for a moment. She asked what happened to Lorna. Callen looked out the window at the empty street and said that the fog took her back on the last night, which was the only thing that had ever been merciful about any of it, and that what walked out into the fog that final night was not Lorna anymore, and everyone present had understood that, and nobody had talked about it much since. He looked back at Tess and said that was 12 years ago, and the town had managed every Harlow season before and since without losing anyone because everyone followed the rule. She asked him what was in the fog, what it actually was, where it came from. He said he didn't know, and she believed him because the not knowing was written all over him, had probably been written there for years. She asked him why nobody talked about it, why there was nothing online, why the town didn't warn people. He said the town did warn people, that Delia had come to her door, that he himself had told her the first evening not to go out. She said that wasn't a warning. That was a sentence with no context. He said he understood that, and that he was sorry, and it was the first time she had heard anything like an apology from anyone in Harlow's Creek, and it landed differently than she expected. She walked home through the quiet morning streets with the fog long pulled back to the tree line, and the boards on the windows looking less strange now that she understood what they were for. She stopped in front of her house and looked at the bare windows, and went inside and found the box of boards in the garage that she hadn't understood the purpose of when she first arrived, stacked neatly against the wall like Hobbs had known she'd need them eventually. She started measuring. Wren called that afternoon. Wren had moved to Harlow's Creek 8 months before Tess, drawn by similar reasons. Cheap rent, distance from a life that had gotten too loud, and had become the closest thing Tess had to a friend in town, the kind of easy friendship that forms quickly between people who are both trying to figure out the same unfamiliar place. Tess told her what Callen had said. There was a pause on the other end, and then Wren said she knew about the Harlow season, had been through one already last year, had followed the rule, and it had been 11 deeply unsettling nights, and she had come out the other side intact. Tess asked her why she hadn't said anything. Wren said she hadn't known how to bring it up, and that she'd assumed Tess would figure out the way everyone did, from Delia, and that she was sorry she hadn't just said it directly. Tess accepted that, and asked her what the fog looked like from inside her house. Wren was quiet for a moment, and then said it looked like it was breathing. That night was the second night of the Harlow season, and Tess sat in the living room with every light in the house on and watched the fog coming off the woods and press against the front windows, and understood now in a way she hadn't the night before what she was looking at. It moved with too much consistency, thickened in certain areas and thinned in others in a pattern that didn't match any other behavior she could account for, and twice she thought she saw shapes in it that were tall and slow and not shaped quite right, though when she focused on any one spot directly the shape wasn't there anymore. She kept the lights on. She did not go near the door. She was awake until nearly 4 a.m, and when she finally slept it was on the couch with her phone in her hand, and every latch in the house checked twice. The third day, she spent boarding the windows. Callen helped without being asked, showed up mid-morning with his own tools, and they worked through it mostly in silence. By late afternoon, every window was covered except the small one above the kitchen sink, which they left half-board, so she could still get light and air during the day. Harlan came by in the early evening, the town sheriff, a man in his late 50s who carried himself with a specific kind of calm that came not from ease but from long practice. He introduced himself properly for the first time, shook her hand on the porch, and told her she had done the right thing with the windows. He said if she heard anything unusual at night she should not investigate it, not open a door or window to look, not respond to any sound that seemed to be asking her to come outside. She asked him if that happened, if the things in the fog made sounds that were designed to draw people out. He said it had been known to happen, and left it at that. She wanted to ask more, but something about the way he said it closed the subject in a way she respected. He left just before the sun went down. Tess locked the door and stood in the boarded-up house and listened to the town go completely silent around her as the dark came in, and then About an hour after full dark, the fog arrived, and with it a sound she had not heard before, low and resonant, coming from no specific direction, more felt than heard, like a frequency that the house itself was picking up. She pressed her back against the kitchen wall and stayed very still and told herself she was fine, told herself the board was solid, told herself 11 days was a fixed and finite number. Somewhere outside in the fog, something moved across her porch with a slow and even step, paused at the front door for long enough that she counted to 9, and then moved on. She stayed against that wall until the sound was gone. She was still there an hour later when she realized she hadn't moved and made herself walk to the couch and sit down like a person who was in control of herself. She thought about what Callen had said about Lorna. She thought about what it meant that the thing on her porch had paused at her door, like it was waiting for something. And then somewhere past midnight, from somewhere outside, she heard a voice she knew and had not heard in over a year, and every rational thought she had went quiet at once. She stood up from the couch before she knew she was standing. The voice came again, slightly closer, slightly clearer, and it was saying her name, not shouting it, not desperate, just saying it the way it always had, with that particular cadence she had never heard duplicated in anyone else. Her hand was on the door handle before she caught herself. She stepped back and pressed both palms flat against her thighs and stood in the middle of the living room and breathed. The voice came a third time, and it was right outside the door now, right on the other side of the wood, and it sounded so exactly right that her chest did something physical and painful. She thought about Lorna. She thought about Callen's face when he told her what had happened to Lorna. She thought about the shape on the porch that had paused and counted and waited. She stepped back until she hit the far wall and stayed there with her teeth clenched and her eyes on the door until the voice stopped, which it did, eventually, like a radio being switched off, sudden and complete. The silence after it was the worst part. She stayed on that wall until morning, and when the fog pulled back, she was still standing, and she had not opened the door, and she knew that whatever was out there in 11 days ahead of her, she had just passed the first real test of it. What she did not know yet was that the third night was still coming, and the third night had never once played fair. She just didn't know that yet. That part was still ahead of her. The third day, she did not go to Bette's. She made coffee at home and sat at the kitchen table and thought about the voice. It had been her brother's voice. Her brother had been dead for 14 months. A car accident on a wet highway outside of Portland. Fast and without warning the way those things always were. And she had spent the better part of a year putting herself back together after it. She had not told anyone in Harlow's Creek about him. There was no way for the fog to know his voice. No way for anything out there to have pulled that specific sound out of any available information about her, which meant it pulled it from somewhere else. And that was the part she kept turning over, the part that had kept her against the wall until sunrise. She was not going to talk herself into going outside. She had been clear on that since the moment she stepped back from the door, had felt the decision lock in place with a certainty she trusted. But the fact that it had used his voice meant that whatever was in the fog was not random. It had looked at her specifically, found the thing most likely to move her, and used it. That was not weather. That was not atmosphere. That was something that thought. She called Callen mid-morning and told him about the voice. He was quiet for a moment and then asked her whose voice it was. She told him. He said he was sorry, said it plainly without loading it with anything extra, and she appreciated that. He told her that was how it worked sometimes, that the fog found what it needed and used it, and that the fact that she hadn't opened the door was the only thing that mattered. She asked him if it would try again. He said probably not the same way twice, that in his experience it changed approach each night, that repetition wasn't how it operated. She asked him how he knew that, and he said he'd been through enough Harlow seasons to have observed patterns, said it in a way that told her he had personal reasons for knowing and that she wasn't going to get the details today. She let it go. That day had a strange texture to it, slow and ovalate the way days get when you haven't slept properly, every small task taking slightly longer than it should. She ate something she didn't taste. She read 4 pages of a book and couldn't tell you what they said. The fog was gone entirely during the daylight hours. The woods visible and ordinary behind her back fence. Just trees, just October color. Nothing to account for anything. That was the thing about the Harlow season that she was beginning to understand. The days were completely normal. The sun came up, the birds moved to the yard, Clyde opened the gas station, and Bette opened the diner, and the town ran its quiet routines without incident. It was only after dark that the world changed, and the gap between those two states was wide enough to make the nighttime feel almost impossible during the day and make the daytime feel almost like a lie at night. Wren came over in the afternoon, and they sat on the porch in the thin October sun and drank tea and talked about ordinary things for a while, which was its own kind of relief. Wren had a way of being present without performing it, and Tess had always valued that. Eventually, the conversation landed where it was going to land, and Wren asked how bad the second night had been. Tess told her. Wren set her mug down and looked at the tree line for a moment and said that last year on her 3rd night, she had heard her mother's voice and had made it to the porch before she caught herself. Just the porch, she said, not past the steps. Tess asked what happened when she stopped. Wren said the voice changed, shifted into something that wasn't her mother's anymore, something that didn't sound like any human voice she could describe, and then it stopped. She said that was the moment she understood that the town wasn't being paranoid. Tess thought about that. She thought about it still when Wren left just before sunset, and she locked up the house and settled in for the 3rd night. The first hour was quiet in a way that felt different from the previous nights. Less active somehow, the fog thinner, the shape she usually caught at the edge of her vision mostly absent. She almost thought it was going to be an easier night. Then around 11 the sound started, not the low resonant frequency from the night before, but something higher and more specific, a sound she gradually recognized as music. Faint, distant, coming from the direction of the woods, the kind of music that exists at the edge of audible, the kind you find yourself leaning toward. She did not lean toward it. She put on the television and turned the volume up and watched something she couldn't focus on and kept her eyes off the windows. By midnight, the music had stopped and the fog had thickened back to its usual density, and she thought she had made it through the worst of it. Then all the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a surge, just gone. All at once, the television and the kitchen light and the lamp in the corner and the small nightlight in the hallway. Everything dark in an instant. She sat completely still on the couch in the sudden dark and listened. The house made no sound. Outside, the fog pressed against the boards, and she could feel the pressure of it without being able to explain how. Her phone still had charge, and she turned on its flashlight and swept it around the room, and everything was exactly where it had been. She found the breaker box in the hallway closet and checked it, and every switch was still in the on position. Nothing had tripped, which meant the outage was not coming from inside the house. She stood in the hallway with her phone light and made herself think clearly. She was not going outside to check the meter. She was not opening the door for any reason. She could manage a night in the dark. She went back to the couch and sat in the dark with her phone and its small circle of light and told herself this was manageable. It was manageable right up until she heard the knock. 3 knocks, even and spaced, on the front door. Not frantic, not aggressive. Patient, like someone who had all the time in the world and knew she was on the other side. She did not move. The knocks came again, same rhythm, same patience. Then a 3rd time. Then Callen's voice from the other side of the door, saying her name, saying he'd seen her lights go out and wanted to make sure she was okay. She was on her feet before she finished processing it. She was halfway to the door. She stopped. She stood in the dark hallway with her phone light casting long shadows and thought about what Callen had told her, thought about the voice on the second night that had been her brother and had been nothing. thought about Lorna who would come back, wear it herself like something borrowed. She did not know if Callen would come to her door in the middle of the Harlow season night. She thought probably he would not. She thought probably the thing outside her door knew exactly how familiar his voice had become to her in the past few days, and had chosen it specifically. She backed away from the door. She sat back on the couch. The knocking came one final time and then stopped, and then the voice said her name once more, softer this time, almost sad. And then that stopped too. 20 minutes later the lights came back on all at once like nothing had happened. She sat in the sudden light and breathed. She made it to 4 a.m. before exhaustion pulled her flat on the couch with the lights burning and every latch still locked. She slept for 3 hours and woke up to pale daylight coming to the gap above the kitchen sink, and the woods behind the house looking completely ordinary. She lay there looking at the ceiling for a while, and then sat up and noticed the front door. The latch was locked. The deadbolt was thrown, but on the floor in front of the door, on the inside, was a single muddy footprint that had not been there the night before. She stared at it for a long time. Then she called Callen and asked him straight out if he had come to her door last night. He said he hadn't left his house. She looked at the footprint and asked if it was possible something had gotten inside. He was quiet for 3 full seconds and then asked her to check every room and not to hang up while she did. She checked every room. Every window was still boarded. Every latch was still locked. Every room was empty. She came back to the front hall and stood over the footprint and described it to him, size and shape, the pattern of the tread, the specific red clay mud that matched the soil at the edge of the tree line, and nothing else within a quarter mile of her house. Callen said he was coming over. He was there in 5 minutes, and he stood over the footprint himself without touching it and looked up at her with an expression that was very carefully controlled and said they needed to go see Delia. Delia lived 4 blocks from Tess, in a house that was older than most on the street and better kept. The kind of house that had been maintained with intention over decades. Otto answered the door, said nothing, and stepped aside to let them in. Delia was in the kitchen at the table with a cup of tea and a look that said she had been expecting them before the knock. Callen laid out what Tess had found. Delia listened without interrupting, which Tess was beginning to understand was how she always listened, fully and without filling the space. When Callen finished, Delia looked at Tess for a moment, not at the door or the footprint description, but at Tess directly, studying her face with a focus that wasn't unkind but wasn't comfortable either. Then she asked Tess a single question. She asked if Tess had opened the door at any point during the night, even briefly, even just a crack, even just to listen. Tess said no. Delia nodded slowly and said that was good and that she believed her. Then she said something that Tess turned over for the rest of the day. She said that the footprint being on the inside did not necessarily mean something had come in. It could mean, Delia said, choosing her word with obvious care, that something had tried to come in and left a mark in the trying. Tess asked what the difference was. Delia looked at her cup and said that if something had fully crossed the threshold, they would not be having this conversation, because Tess would not be Tess anymore, and nobody in this room would know the difference yet. She said, yet with a weight that settled over the table and stayed there. Callen drove her home and said she had 8 nights left and had handled the first 3 better than most. She asked what most people did. He said they either left town before it ended or they made a mistake somewhere in 11 days. She asked which was smarter. He said leaving always, but that almost nobody did when it came down to it. By the time you understood what you were dealing with, some part of you had already started listening for it. She thought about her hand on the door handle before she caught herself. She knew exactly what he meant. She went inside and cleaned up the footprint because looking at it wasn't helping, and she had 8 more nights ahead of her. The 4th and 5th nights passed without the fog finding a new angle, which Tess understood by now was not comfort but strategy. It pressed against the house, moved across the porch, made its low sound to the edges of the dark. But it didn't knock, and it didn't speak, and it didn't cut the power. She slept in broken stretches and woke each morning feeling like she had been awake the whole time anyway. The town during the days had a particular kind of solidarity to it that she had not noticed before. People checking on each other with brief nods and short exchanges. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet acknowledgement of people who were all enduring the same thing and knew it. She had become part of that without quite deciding to, and there was something steadying in it. She was at Bette's on the morning of the 6th day when Bette set down her coffee and asked her, directly and without softening it, how she was holding up. Tess said fine. Bette looked at her for a moment, the way someone looks at you when they know fine is a placeholder, and then said that she had been through 19 Harlow seasons, and that the first one was always the one that changed you, not because of what happened, but because of what you learned about yourself in the not happening. Tess thought about her hand on the door handle, thought about how fast she had moved before catching herself, and said she understood what Bette meant. Bette nodded and moved on to the next table, and Tess sat with her coffee and did not think about how the night before she had stood at the boarded window for a long time with her hand flat on the wood, feeling the pressure of the fog on the other side like a pulse. She had not told anyone that part. It was Wren who first said something was wrong, which came as no surprise to Tess later, because Wren had always been the kind of person who noticed things other people were still deciding whether to notice. They were walking back from the diner together on the 7th morning, taking the long way because the air was clear and cold and the daylight felt worth using. And Wren stopped in the middle of the block and looked at her, not at her face, at her, the way you look at something when you're trying to figure out what's different about it. Tess asked her what. Wren said nothing, said it too quickly, and kept walking. But that evening she called Callen. Tess didn't know about that call until later. Callen went to Delia. He described what Wren had said, which wasn't much, just that something felt off about Tess, that she couldn't locate it exactly, that it was more like a texture than a specific thing. Delia listened and then asked Callen when exactly the footprint had appeared, and he told her the 3rd night. And she sat with that for a moment, and then said what she had been afraid to say since the morning they had come to her kitchen. She said she thought the threshold had been crossed partially. Not fully. If it had been full, Tess would be gone already, and the thing wearing her would be better at it by now. But partially, which was something she had only seen once before, which was Lorna, and which meant the door between what Tess was and what the fog wanted her to become was still open just a crack, and had been since night 3. Callen asked what that meant practically. Delia said it meant the thing wasn't inside Tess yet, but it had a hold, a thread, and it was using the remaining nights to pull. She said the gaps would start soon. The small losses of time, the words that came out wrong, the moments where Tess would find herself somewhere in the house without remembering crossing the room to get there. She said by night 8 or 9, it would be most of the way through, and by the final night, it would be finished, and whatever came out of the house on the morning of the 25th would not be Tess in any way that mattered. Callen asked if they could stop it. Delia said she didn't know, and looked at Otto, and Otto looked at the table. Tess noticed the first gap that same evening. She was in the kitchen making dinner, and then she was standing at the back door with her hand on the handle, and the door unlocked, and the fog pressing against the glass panel in the door thick and close, and she had no memory of walking from the stove to the door or unlocking it. She stepped back fast and through the deadbolt and stood in the kitchen breathing, and looked at the stove where the pan had gone cold, which meant she'd been standing at the door for longer than a moment. She did not call anyone. She relocked every door in the house and went back to the stove and finished making dinner, and ate it standing at the counter, and did not look at the back door again. But she noticed the second gap came the following morning. She was reading at the kitchen table, and then she was sitting on the floor of the hallway closet with the door pulled shut in the dark for no reason she could locate. She sat in the closet for a moment and then got up and went back to the kitchen, and her book was still open to the same page, which meant the gap had been short a few minutes at most. She told herself it was sleep deprivation, which was not entirely untrue, and then she told herself it had nothing to do with sleep deprivation, which was more accurate, and then she called Callen and told him about both gaps before she could decide not to, He came over within the hour, and she could see when he walked in that he already knew something, that Delia had already told him what to expect, and that made her angry in a clean and useful way, because it meant they had been discussing her without her, and she was done with that. She said as much. He sat down at her kitchen table and told her everything Delia had said, all of it, without editing. She sat across from him and listened, and when he finished, she sat with it for a moment and then asked what the options were. He said Delia was working on that. She said that wasn't an answer. He said it was the only one he had right now and that he was sorry. She believed him on both counts. Harlan came that afternoon, and the four of them, Tess, Callen, Wren, and Harlan, sat in Tess's living room and talked through it with the boards on the windows and the October light coming thin through the gap above the sink. Harlan had been sheriff through 4 Harlow seasons and had been a deputy through 6 before that, and he had seen 2 people come back wrong, and he spoke about it with the particular weight of someone who had been responsible for outcomes he couldn't control. He said the town had protocols, had things they did when someone was partially taken, and that those things were not simple and not pleasant, and he was not going to describe them in detail, but that they existed and that they were available if it came to that. Tess asked what they involved. He looked at her steadily and said they involved making sure whatever was inside did not finish the crossing, and that the methods were designed to protect the person as much as possible, but that he could not guarantee the outcome. She heard what he wasn't saying. She nodded and said she understood, and asked what else. Wren said Rue, said it quietly, almost to herself, and then said it again louder when everyone looked at her. She said she had been thinking about Rue since the footprint, since the moment Tess had described standing at the back door with no memory of getting there, and that there was something about Rue's connection to fog, the fact of having been born during a Harlow season, that felt relevant in a way she couldn't fully articulate yet. Delia, when Callen called her from the living room and relayed what Wren had said, was quiet for a long time before she spoke. Then she said that Rue was not a solution she would reach for quickly, and that if they were considering it, they needed to understand what they were asking of her. She said to give her until morning. That night was the 8th night, and the fog came in heavier than it had any previous night, visibly denser, pressing the board hard enough that Tess could hear them flex in their frames. She sat on the couch and watched the small gap above the kitchen sink and the way the fog moved against it, and felt the pull of it in a way that was different from before, less external, more like a current running just under her own surface. She locked her hands together in her lap and kept them there, and when the pull came strongest, she thought about Callen's face across the kitchen table, and Wren's voice saying her name on the phone, and Betty's hand refilling her cup, and she held on to those things like handles and rode it out until dawn. In the morning, she found herself at the back door again. Both locks were still thrown. Her hands were at her sides. She had no memory of the last 40 minutes. She stood in the kitchen in the early light and understood that whatever was coming was not going to wait much longer. She showered and dressed and sat at the kitchen table and waited for Callen to come, which he did at 8, and when she opened the door, he looked at her face, and she looked at his, and neither of them said good morning, because it wasn't, and they both knew it. He sat down and said Delia had called him at 6. She asked what Delia had said. He said Delia had agreed that Rue was the next step, but that she wanted to be present when they talked to her, and that she wanted it done today, in daylight, with 3 nights still remaining. Tess asked why 3 nights mattered. Callen said because by night 10 Delia believed the thread would be too far to pull back, and that whatever window existed for Tess was closing at a rate that didn't leave room for waiting. Tess nodded and stood up and got her jacket from the hook by the door and said then they should go now. Callen looked at her for a moment, something moving through his expression that she didn't have a name for yet, and then he stood up and they went. She locked the house behind her and stood on the porch for a moment in the flat morning light and looked at the street and the boarded windows and the absolute stillness of a town holding itself together through the back half of something hard. Somewhere down the block, a door opened and closed. A crow crossed the sky above the tree line. The fog was gone entirely, retreated and invisible, patient in a way that things are patient when they know they're winning. She stepped off the porch and followed Callen down the street toward the library and told herself she was still Tess and that she intended to stay that way and that 3 nights was enough time if they used it right. She believed most of that. The part she wasn't sure about she kept to herself because there was nothing useful in saying it out loud, and she had learned over the past 8 days that useful was the only currency that's spent in Harlow's Creek during the Hollow season. Rue was shelving books when they came in, moving through the stacks with the quiet efficiency of someone who spent most of their time in their own head and had made peace with it. She looked up when the door opened and her eyes went to Tess first, which Tess noticed, and then to Callen and Delia behind her, and something in Rue's expression settled into a kind of resignation that suggested she had been waiting for this visit without knowing exactly when it would arrive. Delia told her to close the library. Rue turned the sign without argument. They sat in the back room among stacked returns and outdated periodicals and a space heater that ticked steadily in the corner, and Delia laid it out for Rue the same way Callen had laid out for Tess. Plainly, completely, without softening the edges. Rue listened with her hands flat on her knees and her eyes on the middle distance, and when Delia finished, Rue asked one question. She asked how far through the thread was. Delia said far enough that they were having this conversation, and not far enough that they were out of options, and that the window was 3 nights. Rue nodded slowly and looked at Tess directly for the first time since they had sat down. It was not a comfortable look to be on the receiving end of, not hostile, just assessing, like Rue was trying to locate something specific and wasn't sure yet whether she'd found it. Then she looked back at Delia and said she would need to know exactly what Delia was asking her to do before she agreed to anything. Delia said that was fair and began to explain. What Delia described was not a ritual, not in any formal sense. There was no ceremony to the Hollow season, no set of instructions passed down in a book somewhere. What existed was older than that and less organized, a body of understanding built from experience over generations that lived in people like Delia the way certain knowledge does, absorbed rather than learned. What she knew about people born during the Hollow season was that the fog recognized them differently, not as prey, not as targets, as something closer to kin. Rue had been born on the 7th night of the Hollow season 26 years ago during one of the heaviest fogs in the town's memory, and from the time she was small, there had been things about her that the town noted quietly and did not discuss in her presence. Animals behaved differently around her. The fog, on the nights it pressed hardest against the town, never pressed against her windows. She had walked outside during a Hollow season once, at 17, on a dare she should not have accepted, and had stood in the fog for 11 minutes and come back inside unchanged. The town had not talked about that either. What Delia believed, and what she had believed since Rue was born, was that Rue existed in a frequency the fog understood, and that this meant she could potentially reach into whatever partial crossing had occurred in Tess and find a thread and disrupt it. Not remove it cleanly, not guarantee anything, but create enough interference that the fog could not complete what it had started before the season ended. Rue listened to all of this and then sat quietly for a moment and then said she had known about most of it and that knowing about it and being asked to use it were 2 different things. Delia said yes. Rue asked what the risk was to her specifically. Delia said she didn't know exactly and that she was not going to pretend otherwise. Rue looked at the space heater ticking in the corner and then looked at Tess and asked her directly what the gaps felt like from the inside. Tess thought about how to answer that honestly. She said it felt like missing a step in the dark. The moment of absence was so brief you almost didn't register it, but the landing was wrong and your whole body knew it before your brain caught up. She said the pull at night felt like a current under her skin that ran toward the fog, and that she was holding against it, but that holding was getting harder. Rue nodded like that confirmed something she had already suspected. She said she would do it. Delia let out a breath that she had clearly been holding. Callen, who had been standing near the door the whole time, saying nothing, looked at the floor for a moment and then looked at Rue and said thank you in a way that carried more weight than 2 words usually did. Rue said not to thank her yet. They spent the rest of the morning working out what it would look like in practice, which came down to proximity and timing. Rue needed to be near Tess during the 10th night, inside the house, present while the fog was at its densest and the pull was strongest. Delia said the 10th night was the right window because the thread would be extended far enough by then to get a clear hold on, but not so far through that the fog would fight back hard enough to put Rue at serious risk. Serious was a word she used carefully, and everyone in the room heard the care in it. Wren, who had come in midway through the conversation and settled herself against the wall, asked what they should do if it didn't work. Nobody answered that directly. Harlan, when Callen called him afterward, said he would be present on the 10th night, and that he would have what he needed if the outcome went the wrong direction. He said it without elaboration, and nobody asked for any. The 9th night arrived, and it was the worst one yet, not in terms of events, but in terms of pressure. The fog was dense in the moment dark fell, no build-up, no gradual thickening. Just there and fully committed from the start. Tess sat in the living room with every light on, and Wren beside her on the couch, and rode the pull for hours. It was stronger than it had been, directional now in a way that earlier nights hadn't been, oriented specifically toward the back door and the tree line beyond it. Twice Tess caught herself already standing before she registered having moved, and both times Wren put a hand on her arm and said her name, and Tess came back to herself without incident. The second time it happened, Tess looked down at Wren's hand on her arm and felt a gratitude, so complete it had no words attached to it. She put her own hand over Wren's, and they sat like that for a while without talking. Somewhere past 2 in the morning, the pressure dropped suddenly, like a change in altitude, and the fog thin enough that the shapes moving in it became briefly, clearly visible through the gap above the kitchen sink. Not suggestions of shapes or things at the edge of perception, but actual forms, tall and slow and utterly wrong in their proportions, moving in no particular direction but present and physical and close. Then the fog thickened again, and they were gone, and the pressure built back up and stayed until dawn. In the morning, Tess found herself in the hallway again, both hands flat on the front door, not reaching for the handle but pressing against the wood, as if feeling for something on the other side. She was there for an unknown amount of time before Wren, who had fallen asleep on the couch and woken to find her gone, appeared in the hallway, and said her name, and she turned around. She looked at Wren, and Wren looked at her, and Tess could see in Wren's face exactly what Wren was seeing. And she said, "I'm still here," said it firmly, and Wren nodded but did not look entirely convinced. Rue came to the house at noon with a bag she had packed herself and did not explain the contents of. She moved through the rooms in a way that was less like checking them and more like listening to them, standing in doorways for a moment before moving on, pausing longest at the back door and the hallway where Tess had been found in the mornings. She did not touch anything. She stood in the hallway for nearly a minute with her eyes closed, and then opened them and looked at the front door and said the thread was further than she had expected. Tess asked how much further. Rue said she could feel it from the hallway, which meant it was close to the surface, which meant the 10th night was going to be harder than Delia had anticipated. She said it without dramatics, and Tess appreciated that. Delia arrived at 4, and Otto with her, and Harlan came at 5 and stood in the kitchen with his jacket on and his hands in his pockets and said very little. By the time the sun went down, the house was full of people who were each carrying their own specific version of knowing what was at stake, and Tess moved among them and made coffee and was as present as she could manage, which was mostly present with 2 or 3 gaps she accounted for her and did not mention. The fog came at 7, earlier than any previous night, and it came from every direction at once. Not from the tree line only, not from the back of the property, from all 4 sides simultaneously, pressing against every boarded window at once with consistency that was nothing like weather and everything like intent. The house groaned once, a deep structural sound, and then was silent. Rue stood in the center of the living room and closed her eyes. Tess sat on the couch and felt the pull come up hard and immediate. stronger than any previous night by a distance she couldn't quantify, and dug her hands into the couch cushions and held. Callen stood near the hallway. Wren sat beside Tess. Harlan stayed in the kitchen doorway where he could see both the front and back of the house. Delia sat in the chair across from Tess and watched her with the focused attention of someone who had done this once before under worse circumstances and was not going to look away this time. The first hour was endurance. The pull was constant and the fog pressed and the house held, and Rue stood in the center of the room with her eyes closed and her breathing slow, and whatever she was doing it quietly and completely. Tess kept her eyes open and her hands on the cushions and counted things in the room to stay anchored. The number of books on the shelf, the pattern in the rug, the sound of the space heater Wren had brought over and plugged in that afternoon. She counted and held and did not stand up. Then around 9, the fog did something it had not done on any previous night. It went quiet, not thinner, not retreated, just silent. The low frequency that had underlain every night of the Harlow season suddenly absent, and in that silence the house felt very exposed, and the pull became something different, less like a current and more like a hand, specific and deliberate, and Tess felt it close around a thread inside her and pull hard in one direction, and she came off the couch before anyone could stop her. She was halfway to the back door when Rue opened her eyes. Rue said her name once, not loudly, and Tess stopped. Not because she decided to, because something in Rue's voice hit the thread, at exactly the right angle, and for one moment the pull went slack. Tess stood in the kitchen doorway with her hand 6 inches from the back door handle and the fog against the glass and whatever was beyond it pressing close, and she could feel both things simultaneously, the fog's pull and Rue's counter to it. She understood she was a rope in this and that the next few minutes would go to decide which direction she went. She turned. Rue held out her hand. Tess looked at it and then at the door. Tess took Rue's hand. It was not a decision she made so much as a direction she chose. The same way you choose a direction when you're standing at a split in a road in the dark, and one way feels like forward and the other feels like disappearing. The moment her hand closed around Rue's, the pull did not stop, but it changed character, became less like command and more like an argument, and that difference was enough. Rue held her hand and did not move and did not speak, and whatever she was doing somewhere below the level of action, in some register Tess could feel, but not observe. Callen moved to the kitchen doorway to fill the space Tess had been standing in, positioning himself between her and the back door without making production of it. Harlan stayed where he was. Wren sat on the edge of the couch with her hands clasped and her eyes on Tess. Delia watched everything at once. The fog outside went through 3 distinct phases over the next 2 hours that nobody in the room fully had language for afterward. The first was pressure, sustained and total, the boards flexing, the house groaning at its joints, the glass in the back door panel fine cracked at the corner in a way it hadn't been before. The second was sound, the low frequency coming back, but different now, aimed, no longer ambient, but directed at the house the way a voice is directed at a person, and Tess felt it in her back teeth and in the base of her skull and in the thread running through her, which pulled toward like a compass needle toward north. The third phase was silence again, but not the tactical silence of earlier in the night. This was wider and more complete, the silence of something that had shifted its approach entirely, and it was in that silence that Tess felt the thread go taut in a way it hadn't before, felt it pull from both ends simultaneously, Rue on one side and the fog on the other, and the sensation was not pain exactly, but was in the neighborhood of pain, a deep interior tension that had no physical location and no way to address. She gripped Rue's hand harder. Rue gripped back. Neither of them spoke. It lasted somewhere between 5 minutes and forever. Tess had no reliable sense of time during it. And then something gave. Not broke. Gave. Like a knot worked loose rather than cut. A gradual release of tension that moved through Tess from her sternum outward and left behind a feeling like a room after a window has been opened, emptier and cleaner and full of outside air. She exhaled. Rue exhaled. Rue let go of her hand and sat down on the floor right where she was standing, not dramatically, just done, like a person who had been holding something very heavy for a long time and had finally been allowed to set it down. Tess looked at her hands, both of them, and then looked around the room at the people in it and said she was still here, same as she had said to Ren in the hallway 2 days ago. But this time she said it like she was certain, and it landed differently. Delia leaned forward in her chair and studied her face for a long moment, and then sat back and said, "Yes, you are." Outside, the fog held its density through the rest of the night, but the pressure was different, less concentrated, like something that had committed its full force to a single push and, having failed it, had no immediate reserve. Harlan stood in the kitchen and looked at the cracked glass in the back door and said nothing. Callen made coffee at some point, and nobody asked him to, and nobody declined it. They sat in the lit house through the last hours of the 10th night, and Tess stayed on the couch and did not stand up and did not drift toward any door. And when dawn came gray and ordinary, and the fog pulled back the tree line on schedule, and the 11th and final night was 1 day away. Rue slept on the couch that day, and Tess let her. She looked young asleep, younger than she seemed awake, and Tess sat in the kitchen with her coffee and felt something adjacent to guilt about what had been asked of her, what had been asked without quite knowing the full cost of asking. Callen came by in the afternoon and sat at the kitchen table and said Rue had done something no one fully understood and that the town owed her something it didn't have a good way to pay. Tess agreed. She asked him how he thought the 11th night would go, and he said he believed the worst was past, that the fog on the final night was typically less active than the peak nights, and that what had happened the previous evening had disrupted whatever fog had been building toward. He said typically with particular care of someone who knew the word was doing heavy lifting. She asked him what happened after the fog lifted on the 25th. He said it lifted clean, same as it had every year, and the town went back to ordinary on a timeline that varied by person. Some people were fine within a day. Some people took the better part of a month. He looked at his coffee and said some things you carried, and that was honest, and she appreciated it. The 11th night arrived, and Tess faced it alone, which was her choice. She told Callen and Ren that she needed the last night to be her own, that she had something to settle with herself that didn't require witnesses, and they respected it even though she could see it cost them something to do so. She locked the house, checked every latch, turned on every light, and sat on the couch and waited. The fog came in at its usual time and pressed at its usual density, and the night passed with a specific quality of an ending, not quiet, not uneventful, but contained, like a storm that had already broken and was now just finishing its reign. The pull was present, and she felt it and held against it, and it did not escalate. Once around midnight, she heard her brother's voice again from outside. Same cadence, same particular way it said her name. And this time she sat very still and let it finish and did not move from the couch and said quietly into the empty room that she knew it wasn't him and that it could stop now. The voice came once more, softer, and then did not come again. She sat in the quiet that followed and let herself feel the loss of him properly, the real loss, the one that had been there since the wet highway outside Portland 14 months ago, and she stayed with it until it was just grief and not a weapon being used against her. And that took a while, but she had the time. At 4 a.m, the fog began pulling back. She watched it to the gap above the kitchen sink, saw it thin and recede in the way it always did at dawn, deliberate and unhurried, back toward the tree line, back into the woods, gone by the time the first real light came into the sky. She unlocked the front door and opened it and stood on the porch in the cold October morning and looked at the street. Boards still on the windows up and down the block. No one outside yet. The air was clear and still and smelled like cold ground and pine, and a complete absence of whatever the fog carried. She stood there for a long time. Callen's door opened before anyone else's, and he came out and stood on his porch and looked at her, and she raised her hand and he nodded. Bette's opened at 7, and Tess was the third person through the door, and Bette put coffee in front of her. without being asked and put her hand briefly on Tess's shoulder before moving on, and Tess sat at the counter and drank it and felt the ordinary world reassemble itself around her the way it does after something has moved through and taken what it came for and left the rest standing. Over the next 2 days, the town came down its boards and went back to itself with the quiet efficiency of people returning from somewhere difficult. Tess helped Rue carry books from the back of the library to a reshelving cart on the 26th, and they worked in comfortable silence for an hour, and then Rue said that what she had felt in Tess on the 10th night was the cleanest partial crossing she could imagine, which was not a compliment exactly, but was as close to reassurance as Rue typically got, and Tess received it in that spirit. She asked Rue what it felt like from her end. Rue thought about it for a moment and said it felt like finding a door someone had left open in a house that was supposed to be locked and pulling it shut, and that the thing on the other side had not been pleased but had not been stronger than the closing. Tess asked if it was fully closed. Rue said yes, said it without hesitation, which Tess noticed and held on to. She stayed in Harlow's Creek. That was a decision she had not expected to make, and then found she had made before she examined it closely, the way she had made the decision to move here in the first place. Fast and from somewhere below deliberate thought, she resealed the back door with new weather stripping and bought a better lock, and took down the window boards on the morning of the 26th with Callen's help and stood in the house with the light coming back in through clean glass and the woods visible and quiet at the back of the yard. The tree line looked the way it always looked in daylight. Just trees, just October, nothing waiting in it. She made herself look at it for a full minute, and then went inside and called Wren, and they talked for an hour about nothing in particular, and it was the best conversation she'd had in months. November came, and the town settled, and Tess settled with it. The cold came in properly, and the woods went bare and entirely visible, nothing hidden in the stripped branches. Callen came for dinner twice in November, and the evenings ran long the way evenings do when conversation has no agenda. Rue came to her door once with a worn paperback and no explanation, and left before Tess could do more than say thank you. It was a good book. She did not think about the fog constantly, which surprised her. It was there in the background the way certain knowledge is, present and accounted for, without needing to be looked at directly. She knew what October meant in Harlow's Creek now, and she had made her peace with the fact that some doors, once the fog found them, were never entirely without a draft. On the 1st of December, she woke at 3 a.m. for no reason she could identify. Nothing moving, no sound outside. She lay there and went back to sleep. On the 2nd of December, she woke at 3 again. On the 3rd, she told herself it was just her body recalibrating after stress and believed most of it. In the morning, she went to make coffee and reached over to flip the kitchen calendar to December and stopped. The November page had the 14th through the 24th circled in pen. She had not done that. The handwriting was almost hers.